Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Beachy-Quick, and I want to thank Corey and all of LSU Press for setting up this virtual launch. He had warned me that I will have no idea if anyone is actually out there, and indeed that's true. But I'm trying to become comfortable with the dumbfounding abyss, and I will read as if I know you are all there. I'm going to read from my brand new book published about a month ago, the beautiful cover from my dear friend Dale Harrow, whose mother actually took the photo of the ocean, called Elements and Offerings. And we'll explain a bit about poems and the sections, but of the whole book, I'll simply say that it's poems written in serial form over the past 10 to 12 years. And these kind of long serial poems existed in independent ways from each other. And I simply couldn't figure out how to put them together in a way that felt like a cohesive book for a really long time. And with some cutting and some patience and some searching out of hidden forms of connection, I finally came to a kind of feeling that the book was ready to be out in the world. And Elements and Offerings as a title really comes from the book's kind of dearest concerns and hopes. Um, I've often, as many poets are, I think, have considered the poet as a sort of first philosopher, someone who's been put in the world, thinking that all of us have been put in the world in such a way that we have to explain the nature of it and our being in it to ourselves. And so I've spent years reading pre-Socratic philosophy, translating the same, and loved this area in human history where there was an inability or a disinterest in pulling apart the poetic from the natural, the historical, the mythological, the theological, and wanted to write poems that were somehow participating that sense that one has been dropped into the world and has to find a way to describe what it is the world is. And then I've also, I think, anecdotally, like the first poem I ever remember writing when I was 14 or 15 years old was actually a sonnet about John Keats's sonnet about reading Chapman's translation of Homer, which, 30 plus years in hindsight seems like a very strange thing for a young person wanting to be a poet to do. But it has sort of marked the nature of my poetic life right up to this moment where something in me and the instinct to write a poem is to write a poem back to other poets, back to other poems. I've come to think of a poem I write in a certain sense as a kind of offering back to those poets and those poems that I loved the most, this absurd hope, but a real hope of trying to find a way to take part in a conversation that I can't have a voice in any other way than writing the poem. So with that as a kind of broad overview of some of the book's hopes, I thought I might read the opening poem. Um, and my my college self, who so desperately wanted to be a poet that I could barely talk about it with anyone, had as a backup plan, assuming that poetry wouldn't be a thing I could make work out in my life in any real way. My backup plan was to become an art historian of Sung Dynasty Chinese art, which goes a long way to tell you the kind of practical life skills that I have in place. And this poem is titled The Sung Dynasty or The Song Dynasty after the paintings that I loved the most of ink on silk or paper and the kind of beautiful way in which clouds, fog, mist, waterfall were created not by drawing them in, but by leaving the silk or the page blank. Um, and this is a poem for Seth Braverman. The Song Dynasty. One way To make snow in mountains is to leave the paper blank and ink in the crags and pines. A scholar's hut by the flowing stream, such cold water for the tea, but there are other ways. The mind makes its equal signs and leaves them unspoken. A world much thought about, but thinking leaves no trace. The blankness snow is to the child wrapped in her blanket, the snow there even in June, the summer snow. I know, you know. Imagine the solstice is a gong that rings out an echo song. Nothing lasts longer than the morning fog. Clouds can be made just as the snow is made. And so of mist, vague dews, so of water dropping off a cliff, so of the steam curling up as the cup cools. You leave the page blank and ink in the dark dream of pines, law of the pines, the scholars of the Sung dynasty discovered, painting the world on silk, on paper, a principle called mind or fire, one or might. You, children of snow and clouds, can make snow and clouds for yourselves. Find on the blank page some oblivion and add water to the inkstone, a drop or two. Begin by painting dew. The first large section is titled A Library of, and it's actually inspired, as many poems of mine in late years have been, by a work of visual art. In this case, an installation building size by the artist Ronnie Horn, who in Iceland has a piece called The Library of Water that has these cylinders filled with the melted glacial ice of glaciers that are even now in the process of disappearing. And that idea of the archive of a world that we can only guess at its history and its nature from the remnants of it, as changed as they might be, I found extraordinarily moving, and began to think of the letters of the alphabet in strange ways. And one of the ways that I've thought about the alphabet is that each letter is a kind of strange archive filled with memories that are, some of the most personal memories any one of us might have, all the way to a series of associations, of collective symbols, of the whole way in which a poem can build around the simplest element of language, not even a syllable in some cases, but just a letter. I should also say that I wrote many of these poems while my two daughters were growing up. Hannah from about 4 to 18, um, Iris from birth to about 8 or 9, and that experience of being a father, and a father well aware of himself being still a son, kind of ripples throughout this. And so I thought I might just read some of these alphabet poems uh, that are tied to children. F. Forget me not is whose command to give. The feeling of awe got over me, watching my child lace her shoe. The dog opened his mouth, and in the bee flew. The hard work isn't some agony. The mouth just opens, the grass just grows. A tangle in the mind, those loose strands, memory pulls the knot tighter. Her hair as she runs by a band, poorly bound. I, and the one called Iris is also a cloud, purple and yellow and red to the sight. And the one called Hannah is also a sun, and the sun is ignited clouds. And the I, it that is an altar a child made, a column, a caryatid walking with the fragment of the temple roof on her head, offering to others this weight of the sky, block tower, girder in the rubble, stalk of winter wheat, stubble field of September corn. And the more humble forms, the lower case, below us, yet ourselves, the tree a child draws, green circle on a pencil, thin line, and dandelion gone to seed, and the one who makes his wish to have no idea. J. Of justice, who covers her breasts, turns aside in the kitchen to turn the radio on, threatens with furies the sun if it loosens its measure, scents fire with spices and breathes in the flame, says the soul speaks the language of ears and eyes, says war is what is shared, says war is precedent of all, says salt water gives life to fish but kills a man, weeping sweeps the floor, says as child is to father, man is to who will not say the next word. What is born from fire to fire returns. All is, even night, even the child's eyes underwater, even the child breathing underwater, swimming lessons, the principle that tunes the lyre, tunes the bow. L. Of the lost child, child who feels her heart's gone missing, child who wanders far from fear into the woods, who makes of leaves a crown to cover her head, child who chases the creatures that run from her rule, white of rabbit's tail, green disk of the gleat of the deer's midnight eye, who puzzles out the path where thought alone makes the nettles tremble and walks it, child who enters a cave, discovers the night is rooted there, and in the husk the sun dropped as it rose. She makes her bed, that child, that seed. M. My my memory, my mind, the theory thinks it thinks, my mansion, my home, memory in those rooms of closed doors, crumbling walls. For a long time, silence astonished my heart, my memory cloud, a complex song, eyes and thunderbolt, and one grain of millet dropped makes a sound. What is there to think that is there to think? Upload, invoice, subject heading, no attachment. There's the child on a cloud laughing. There's the child who sings along. There's the child who disappears when the father writes down the song. And lastly, of this W, of the letter W, who sometimes on silent wings, wren, write, nests in the eye, but not in the ear, holy homonym and sacred ritual of how to disappear in plain sight. Uh, I have a strange love of silent letters in the language, and I've written poems over time just thinking about the oddity of a W that makes no sound, but somehow the word isn't pronounced correctly without adding the silence in. Um, the next section is titled A Braid, and it weaves together three different long poems. One is titled Elemental, and Elemental is really a kind of thinking through the first philosophy of Heraclitus, and was written as I was doing the work of translating Heraclitus's early fragments. Another section, kind of awkwardly enough, is titled Inf, just the three letters, INF. I've been really concerned not only with letters, but syllables, with phonemes as the kind of strange sources of meaning that both resist immediate meaning, but which all kind of articulatable meaning gathers around. And I, had in mind, and this is also during drone strikes of the last two administrations of of infantry and the infinite and the infant, all kind of combining together. And so I was really working on a series of poems that's simply exploring what opens up as poetic possibility just from the kind of mantra repetition of those basic sounds. And then continuing on sound as a primary concern. The other poems are titled Oracle, Auricle, kind of exploring the idea that we hear in the air if we listen properly, a kind of prophecy that lyric poetry has always tried to attune itself to. And these are braided together, by which I mean one follows the other, three different strands plaited together into an entire section. And I'll just read a few of each one so you can get a feel of what each poem itself is, but what they feel like when they begin to kind of tease each other into a different coherency. Elemental. One dies to become another one, motherless, the atoms. The earth is good and bad. The stupid don't see what they see. The blind see more. The voice that calls me dumb comes from the sun. Oracle. Out the cloud, a voice spoke to us, to us. The voice said, make no images. A crocodile, a boat, a rocket ship. Look up, there's mom, there's you, there's an ant, a snake, a shoe, says the child looking up at the clouds, says the child looking up at the clouds. I never saw the sun. I thought the sun was a fire, the shadows fed the flame in the cave, and when every leaf on the tree became a mirror, the tree burst into light. I couldn't see myself until I stepped nearer and nearer, and among the leaves I found the dark cave again and rehearsed what I'd learned. Fighter jet and drones, bees and honey, elections and stones. The screens fill up each year with the never yet seen end of the world. Or is it the edge? Where is the edge? Is it where Agamemnon walks down the red carpet to take a bath, or some other scene? Achilles barefoot before his boat, singing a song to no one who's listening. So shiny, the metal reflects the hand that comes to grasp it, and the statue gets darker that way. The winners take home their man made of gold. Oddly, a poem about the Oscars, somehow. Um, Statues made of gold. Imph, imph. What falls from brightness, isn't it also bright? Pollen maybe in those petals that hide the wound, or the litter of the stars, those bright tissues the gods wipe their eyes when they laugh so hard they cry and drop the refuse down in the dark where beauty overtakes us who look up. To study it all is to become less. Then ignorance doesn't work so well anymore. Can't get so small it cancels my life, but I feel it, the gap as it nears, waking the similes, like. Elemental. Throws it square on the bare wall, where in the little square of light, I think of the little square of light, a kind of emptiness, or is it the sun's discarded geometry, not subject to, not object of? Someone becomes the beginning every day of his own desire, or is it his demise, as a tree becomes an apple and truth a tooth? Oracle. The wind changed me into a deer. The same wind blowing the army away blew away my father. I like being a deer. I eat the grass that is my altar. In the morning, the clouds fill up the trees. Sometimes the trees fill up the sky. A thin gold chain the goddess made she clasped around my neck. So I came to the holy grove. I sacrificed my name. Imph, imph. The critics called it pathetic, but I kept on. The stars couldn't all be wrong. And the poems that picnic in eternity, and the rushes that in the heart grow up big and sing. 3 times I called out to recipient unknown, give me a task to bend down my head as the wind tasks the reed it touches its tongue to water to sing. And give me love that weak and give me love that's weak no more, that in deep water seeks no shallow, seeks no shore. And the very last section are poems also that I've been writing occasionally over the years. I've been very taken with the poet Paul Celan's thought that thinking and thanking are cognate, that to learn how to think properly is to become properly grateful, that to learn how to think properly is to also learn how to think in an honest way. And so I've been writing poems to teachers and friends and family. Um, when, for reasons somewhat inexplicable to me, the poem feels energized towards them. If I haven't yet written you a poem, be patient. One will be coming. They just, as most things to me these days, they come slow. The no thing, nothing is for Kylan Rice. Oh, this is my cat. Um, his name's Pip. I'm gonna put him back down, I think. The no thing, nothing is. Death came before life ended. A fever in the lower case ill a that B fearfully describes as a silence that tried to but couldn't survive. The stars predicted the O would ripen into a green olive, and the philosopher talking in his sleep recites the alphabet, a love poem to all he could not know. Life came before death ended, a fever in the uppercase Z, and the blind prophet, after a sip of blood, spoke of another letter he couldn't pronounce, but pulling from his pocket a fig, pointed at it, pointed at it, the fig he pulled from his pocket, mouthing the words, if only. Sense without sense of, for Bill Curry. A man shoulders his burden, and he can't say himself what he carries. A book, a bundle of sticks, or is he himself what he carries? A spark, a description of a spark. A moth carrying her dust to the moon flies across the field of vision, drawing your eye away from its occupation. Not revelation or contemplation, some form of opening the eye wider. He is still there, the man, making by hand an obscure thing, muttering to himself in the gathering dark songs his mother used to sing. Not his mother, the the moth, some songs about the moon. He's hard to see, and you cannot hear him. This man maybe you are, or were, or could be. So central once to our story, he seemed a hero. Now we've gotten nearer the fact he is more distant, more true. True, he carries inside himself some fragment of the sun. True, he is for us as a word written in a language we can read in the margin of a book we cannot. Let it be enough. Let it be a kind of proof. And I'm going to read one more poem, a slightly longer one. Um, and it needs a little bit of explanation. It is oddly, I think, one of the most personal poems I've ever written, whatever that might mean. My father, when I was young, was in the habit of sending me waxed leaves from the forests of upstate New York. I lived in Colorado, and that was the way I came to see the kind of brilliance of the colors of the fall foliage out east. They'd arrive in department store boxes, these waxed red glories of maple. So that's one thing to know. And the other is that the poem is really exploring what it is to know and really is trying to think about Plato's Theaetetus and this way that in that dialogue, he comes to two ways of describing what knowledge is. One, that the mind is like a soft wax that takes the impression of whatever falls against it. Or two, that the mind is like a dovecote or a columbarium, and you walk into it, and there's these birds flying through your inner life, and each one of those birds is a form of knowledge. And if it lands in your hand, that knowledge is something then that you know, but that there's also a bird of oblivion. Memory wax, knowledge bird for R.C. Quick. I saw him in the summer when the leaves were green, down by the lake where ivy covered the ground, where the dogwoods knew pale moon flowers browned at the edge by brittle June. I saw him then fishing for lake trout, throwing the sunfish too bony back. The sun moved across the sky around the earth a day, and bees, those day laborers, heaved pollen and carried a sting, and bore on their gleaming backs a stripe of day and a stripe of night, a robber moon, thief of her own life, and in the hive round as the moon, they locked the work of the field away in wax vaults, food for time to eat some other time, the bees. In the fall, I went away to where I lived the year. He'd walked the changed woods, gathering leaves no longer living, cast in the color shroud of no one's weaving. A brighter thought thinks the goldfinch dull, though the cardinal pretends not to notice or know. And taking death's small portion home, dipped the leaves in paraffin wax, let them dry, let them cool, put them in a department store box, and sent them through the air to my home. Look, I could be there with him in the woods no other way. No other path led to the maple leaf's dying sun red larger than my hand that held it. No other path led to the oak leaf cinder glow below dark ash orange. The dark faith sunspot hours of yellow beach, the minutes of green flame faith buried within the darkening love of the almond leaf. Leaf by leaf I took them out and put them on the floor, and when there was no more, I put them back in the empty box, fit on the lid, and hid new memory in the closet with the other dead years. Closet where as a child I hid myself and hid my fears. From where in the night I could hear voices speak my name, could hear a song play on a cylinder of wax, a violence, a violin, a piano note beneath the static, and the static like a heartbeat throbbed, like a sudden wind blown through the mind's tree wax-covered leaves, a wind that suddenly dies, the voices, they were legion, that chorus in the blood, mumbling out the grave, delay, gravel on the cemetery driveway, the stone, time wears away their names. Listen. Child no longer young who used to play, dipping finger in the candle wax and peeling it off like another skin. The fingerprint lit up by flame, melting it, doing it again, and that other finger, the one not yours, the one not seen by anyone, that finger that pressing down on the mind's hard wax softens it. Then there is nothing that won't make its impression. Sun script on small waves, sun page on flat stone, sun shaft shot down through the canopy maze of the dark leaves, the bright spot on the ground. And more faces, the people I love, strangers, the music of their least thought words. The baby's sleeping with his mouth open. I don't think that's how you spell it. The weatherman got it wrong. Helplessly recorded on the wax hemisphere until so many voices overlap. No single voice remains, not a chorus, a chaos, a static, a hum, and then some voice asks you what you think, and then some voice asks you to think. I think the beehive looks like the full moon that it lights up. The mind says to itself, I think the child's hand is an oak leaf, a theory. What the soul says to itself is thinking. So many leaves. The eye says to itself, from trees fall down into the wax. I know the edges touch and the wax melds, and I don't know, the leaves together. What I know can't be told apart, says the tongue to itself, all by itself. What I know, I can't tell. I can't pull it apart. There's a second half to that poem, but I think I'll stop and invite Corey in. Um, and there's some time for questions, I believe.
That's right. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a brilliant poem. I got kind of chills from that. So thank you for reading that. And also wanted to thank everyone for tuning in and spending your afternoon with us. I wanted to especially shout out a couple people in part to make Dan feel a little bit less alone in the void here. So I want to thank Paul for tuning in from Pittsburgh, Alyssa from Fort Collins, Marissa from Florida, Gordon from Cape May, New Jersey, Ariadne from Fort Collins, and we have Richard from St. Paul. These are just the people who I asked where everyone was tuning in from. So yeah, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I want to remind everyone that if you have a question for Dan, put it in the chat and I will ask him. And we already have a couple questions, so let's get into it. I'm gonna start with a question from Ariadne, and then I'm gonna go back to a couple of your great questions, Marissa. Ariadne asks, Dan, do you have a heuristic, excuse me, or trick for balancing the knowable and the nonsensical in your writing? What is it to know or to feel? I thought that would be a fun way to open up the question.
Yeah, this will sound like an oblique answer at first, but these ideas between sense and nonsense are much on my mind these days. There's a new book of essays based on lectures from Susan Stewart called Poetry's Nature, and the first essay is thinking about places and poems from Wallace Stevens all the way back to anonymous Old English and Middle English songs of the places where bird songs are transliterated as kind of nonsense syllables and ho ho heys and hums and all of those kinds of things. And it's an essay really thinking about how sense has to learn how to gather around these places of nonsense, that nonsense isn't in opposition to the possibilities of knowing, but actually maintains a mystery inside the rigidities of knowing. I've kind of come to think in those ways myself. I love it in Oppin's great poem of Being Numerous, where he talks about art being the location where the known and the unknown touch. And so, especially inside a lyric practice that's so devoted to the inherent intelligences hidden inside the ear, there are places where the language gets to eclipse the mereness of its meaning into something stranger, more musical, that I really kind of trust to. So, I think ideally a poem, you know, um, doesn't necessarily leave you knowing more, but it leaves you with the capacity to be in larger, more honest forms of knowledge making. In a way, it returns us to a place of question, rather than to a place of fact.
I think that's actually a great segue to Marissa's question, which I'm going to ask you. But beforehand, I want to say hello to Seth from El Salvador. Thanks for tuning in. So Marissa asks, after spending years with the pre-Socratics, with Heraclitus, that idea that the principle tuning the lyre also tunes the bow or bow, which comes up in your poem. What does that mean to you, and how does it live in the poems?
Yeah, well, thank you, Misha, for such a beautiful question. Um, these ideas in Heraclitus, his particular sense of harmony, has been deeply moving, deeply instigating to me. And it's, you almost have to imagine, the image of it, of a bow that is more or less straight, as I tend to think of it, straight as the first person pronoun capitalized. And that the energy that pulls the string back bends the bow into a circle, rather than how we think about harmony as a kind of octave of a voice matching another voice an octave below it. The oldest sense of harmony is this kind of tension, a place where oppositions join and meet, like a dovetail in carpentry. So that sense that the same principle makes the lyre a five-stringed instrument, and the sound is made by plucking the string, is the same principle by which an arrow flies off a bow. Is both troubling and beautiful to me, that somehow it owns up to the strange history that poetry has always been woven into terrible histories of violence that themselves become songs that mouths unborn later sing. Our own mouths sing these songs. I'm thinking of translating the Iliad right now. But it's also this sense that I don't know, that something inside poetry is paying attention not just to the possibilities of self-expression, but self-expression is actually an instrument not unlike the string of a tuned lyre or the tension of a bowstring. That the poet themselves is an instrument pulled back by force that makes something as rigid as the self that says I into something as powerful and unexpected as the poet's oracular O.
Thank you so much for that, Dan. I'd like to get into a question from Kristen, and then go back to another question that Marissa had. This is from Kristen and Robin and Fiddle. Um, they ask, I love thinking about every alphabet letter as an archive of memories or a collection of consciousness. I'm thinking about each poem as maybe its own archive, or memories, or collection of consciousness. How does each poem's dedication deepen that archive?
Hmm, that's a lovely question, and thanks, Kristen and Robin and Fiddle and Banjo um, for joining in for an hour. Um, I mean, I also just want to say I love that idea too. I love the idea of a letter as somehow holding more within it than a poem itself can manage to hold. I love feeling, I don't know, the strange awe and bewilderment one can come to when one examines the most minimal portions of the medium by which we make poems, and that there somehow can be more in the letter B than there could be in an epic. And part of that is just one of the words for word in ancient Greece is epos, from which we get epic. And even there I feel like just this ancient wisdom that continues to like radically inspire me, that properly understood every word is a poem. It's like, how can we tune ourselves to these forms of memory and consciousness that allow us to participate, if only for a brief lyric while, in those larger poetic possibilities of meaning. And the dedication, how it relates to that, I don't exactly know, to be totally honest. Like, it feels as if the dedication, in a certain sense, is a strange way to put it, but it's like a very selfish form of admission that this person is some way tied to the archive that the poem itself is opening up. And it's, in a very weird way, the dedication is a form of gratitude to say something in you or of you, your presence over these years, the ways in which we've talked with one another, been with one another, have opened up for me a way of thinking. that without that connection simply wouldn't exist. And so, it's like like giving the gift of the library back to the person who gave me the library card.
Ed and Seth, thank you for your questions. We're going to get to them in a second, and I appreciate you asking them. I'm going to ask another question from Marissa now, and then I do want to talk a little bit about thanking and thinking, and then we can get to those other questions. So Marissa here asks, the goddess clasped a thin gold chain around the speaker's as dear neck, but like feels like more than a gift. Something has already been surrendered to get there. The transformation, maybe the name, maybe the human self entirely. What is the nature of that exchange? And can you tell us a little bit what she's referring to?
Yeah, that's one of the poem oracles that talks about being transformed or changed into a deer, and um, this gold necklace, which and probably the only way to answer. I'm such a bad poet at explaining things. I apologize, which is a useless apology. It should come before, but then I wouldn't need to apologize. But that poem is about this moment before the Trojan War begins, where in order to get a win, to take all the many ships that are sailing to Troy, that the only way Agamemnon is convinced that can happen via a prophecy given to him is to sacrifice his own daughter Iphigenia. And there are all these like alternate tales, and one of the kind of most beautiful ones to me is that, at the last moment, as Agamemnon is about to sacrifice his daughter to create this wind to blow the ships away, that a goddess comes and steals her off of it and leaves a deer in her place. And so that idea of that transformation of innocence into a deer that then lives inside these woods sacred to the goddess that did the saving, and that image that I remember from Sir Thomas Wyatt's Who So List to Hunt, where there is the name of I'm Caesar's, don't touch me, written around the necklace. Like all of these like um kind of unforgettable influences kind of came together into that small lyric poem.
You've been requested to talk a little bit about thinking and thanking, and I do want to want to tag along to that a little bit because um, I'm really interested in this idea of the two of those as cognates, and I guess I want to talk about maybe indulgently gratitude. I'm kind of interested, um, like in hard times, how can we find, whether it's in poetry or language, gratitude? I just feel like it's connected to that idea. Maybe it's not.
No, I think it very much is, and I should say like everything I'm saying, are a part of an ongoing set of thoughts that I'm still learning how to be in. Like I did have this realization, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago that in some ways all I'm trying to do is to learn how to think properly. Um, that seems like such a mundane, non-poetic thing to talk about until you take someone like Paul Celan seriously and take this hazardous guess that to think and to thank are cognate, that there's somehow actually the same sort of activity. And to like your question, Corey, like it is such an extraordinarily hard time to find places of honest gratitude. It's just it's hard. The world feels, to me, I should simply say, filled with a lot of fear and a lot of things that I don't know how to understand. And not in a poetic way, like in a dumbfounded kind of way. And though it might be not a kind of gratitude that consoles, um, I think it's a kind of gratitude that is real, that to learn how to think properly, as I kind of understand it, is to think with and to learn how to think with an accuracy that's honestly revelatory of that which is being thought towards, not a form of not a form of ownership, not a storing a fact away into some vault where it'll get to be true for all time, but just this step by step asking of a question that gives you the feel of the thing it is you're thinking toward. And then most often a kind of retreat back from it. You know, this sense that if thinking has taken you towards the actually knowable thing, your relationship changes to it as not a thing that you want or a desire, but that a thing you recognize, and the power of that recognition is a responsibility not to harm it, a thankfulness for its actual existence that now your existence is in the face of. And, you know, I do feel like a lyric poem can be an experiment in how to bring us honestly and actually into the face of an other, be that the person a poem is dedicated to, be it a deer with a gold chain around her neck. All of which is to say, I do think poems are a kind of training ground, a kind of practice of being in the world as fully as possible in ways that recognize the even deeper reality of all of that which isn't you. And that's a form of gratitude, I think, a thoughtful gratitude.
There's a beautiful comment in the chat by Bill Curry that I want to read. Bill says, "Your poetry grows from gratitude and is passed on to your readers. I wonder and pray that this is returned to you." I really love that. So thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that, Bill.
Thank you,
Um,
Bill.
I want to ask you something silly from Ed, then we'll get into two kind of bigger questions, and then I have one more from me as well. Ed says, "For fun, I have been reading the alphabet poems in the order of the spelling of words, such as love, Love. Is that an injustice to the printed order?"
It's so funny, Ed, that you would bring that up. I was telling Corey before that the way I want to, I mean, I should say this is only the second time I've ever read from this book. The first was last night. That I want to just ask the audience to give me a word that they love and then read the poems that spell out that word. All of which is to say, Ed, I think that's exactly how the poem should be read, is you should spell words and read the poems that make it up. I think that's a truer form of reading.
I want to get into this question from Seth that I think I might butcher, so I'm going to do my best. It's about repetition. So the question is, in the titles INF dash INF dash, in the poems, like the final poem, repeating a day and of night, what are the different ways repetition is often working in your poems, or what are the ways you hear the repetition when you read your work? And Seth says, this is both actual and oral repetitions.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, Seth. Thank you. And for tuning in from El Salvador is especially astonishing. Um, You know that, and again, I think I have a unfortunate tendency to sort of answer a question by taking a couple of um, twists and turns to get there. And you know, like one of the things that fascinates me in the possibilities of lyric practice are the ways in which experiment and tradition can be woven back together. I kind of came of age as a poet at a time where the traditional and the experimental were radically oppositional forces, and I had somehow a doubt about that, and I was always interested in trying to locate myself as a poet exactly in the middle of that conflict, of that tension. And doing so has allowed me to take very seriously, you know, certain aspects of traditional prosody that I think maybe aren't taught with a great deal of seriousness all the time anymore. Things like rhyme, things like refrain, things like received form, metrics, all of that are essential aspects of what I want to be exploring. And it feels to me that rhyme and repetition, they bear a relationship to one another. The rhyme, as you point out, Seth, is a repetition that the ear picks up on, even though the words themselves are different. A repetition is often a verbatim retelling of a line or a particular sort of word, a doubling of it. And part of why I turn to repetition and rhyme so often in my poems is I have this like strange poetic faith that they usher us into a poem's world in a way that few other linguistic tools allow us. And by that I mean a strange thing. I mean, it feels to me that time is different inside a poem than time is inside a day, that the hours in a poem get to repeat in a way that they don't get to repeat in our lives. And that kind of linear march of birth to the end of a life that we can't figure out a way to escape in our waking and sleeping hours is something that we're given a reprieve from inside of lyric spaces. And one of the ways that you can imagine repetition and rhyme working is there this strange, insistent denial of linear time in favor of mythic time, in favor of a time that turns over and over again into a circle. So that properly heard, my hope is that those places of repetition usher us into different temporal possibilities in which song is an ongoing recurrence.
We've got one more question from Ed. I have one more question for you, and then we're going to ask you a final question. So this is sort of the last, you know, notice that if you'd like to ask Dan something, now is the time to do it. Um, this question is from Ed. Ed asks, how are sounds, images, and feelings interwoven in this collection?
Well, ideally, um, the poems, I'd love for the poems to reach a pitch where those aspects can't be really told apart from one another. It goes back to many questions that are being asked, including Misha's last one, which, I'm interested in the place where a poem works to make a thought, a felt thing more than a thought thing, a feeling, a thinkable thing more than it's like these places of confusion where sound, image, symbol, metaphor become intrinsically tied to one another. That to me is like one of the highest achievements a poem can reach. I don't know how often I've ever reached it. In some ways, I don't know if any of the poems in here do that as I would most want them to do. But I can promise that every poem in here is an earnest attempt to make a poem.
I've got one more question for you, and I'm going to try to get this done by 3. So, but I did want to ask this because this is on my mind. So, there's it's something that you said that really fascinated me during your book talk which is that poems are a means of participating in a conversation. So this is fascinating to me because this conversation naturally is like across time and place. So I'm thinking about like sending letters in a way, because but maybe like a letter that you're not sure if it's received, because you never can really know if someone is going to like see or respond. And oftentimes you can't because you're writing to someone who maybe lived 1,000 years ago. Um, but so letters doesn't work necessarily in a way either because poetry is kind of a public forum. So I'm just curious, like how do poetic conversations work?
I I don't I don't know in some way. I mean, like you're right. This poetic conversation is one happening in verifiable time for all of us, and I'm really grateful for being in these kinds of conversations. That other conversation that seems to span millennia, it's a different one, and it requires, I think, a kind of strange epistemology that to go back to Ed's previous question, that the way in which a poet might inscribe in their poem the think, feel, the pulse, the blood heat, the perception, thinking here strongly of Keats listening to the nightingale beneath the mulberry bush as he wrote Ode to a Nightingale. That somehow the poem kind of keeps open and alive and in an exceptional form of the present tense, an experience that otherwise would be closed and unavailable to any one of us, which is to say, like, that conversation gets to continue if and only if you can learn, like, in a weird way, to think as another poet has learned to think, who learned to think from the way another poet learned to think, which is to suggest that a lot of the things that we might in lesser moments think of as wholly private, my thoughts, my feelings. Poetry insists that there is a radical community inside of those spaces. So the way to participate is in a certain sense to learn how to write both humbly and audaciously enough to think along the thoughts that another poet has thought, to make that available, to take it as a test. Like, no one's interested in a poem that can only be thought by the person that wrote that poem. It's an amazing frustration to be in the face of work like that. But for a work that somehow is inviting you in as a reader to participate in the very thinking it's initiating itself to think in, then we're in some other radically human affirming art, a place that says no one is alone where you fear you are most alone. And I think that's what I mean by that conversation, that it stays ongoing and is ongoing in ways that extend extraordinarily past the limits of my own life. And to be able to write a poem that is part of that, learning to see, learning to feel, learning to think in the ways that others have learned to feel, see, and think, then there's no work that's happier to me than the writing of a poem.
I want to pass along a comment from Francis Benson in the chat. Francis says, "Lovely to see you and hear you." I've got one more question for you. I swear this is the final question. This is our traditional last question that we ask to authors, and that is, now that this book is out in the world, what are you working on now?
First, let me say hi to Fran. That's wonderful to know you're there, Fran. Right now, I'm uh, well into my third year of translating Homer's Iliad. Um, I'm in book seven, around line 150 something. Book six was like one of the most humane human documents I've ever, encountered, where Hector leaves the battlefield and goes and sees his wife, and seven is not quite like that. So I'm not as rapturously involved, but it's my daily practice is translating 10 to 12 lines of Homer. And then really unexpectedly, for years now, I've been translating ancient Greek, and now every day, Monday through Friday, I translate Homer as the sun rises. And there's this feeling, because I have to write it all the Greek I write by hand, and then I make a literal translation interlined, and then I get it onto the computer, like trying to feel my way into what feels right and true, to the text, in a poetically ambitious but honest way. And it's like this love, like I'm still half in a dream state. I feel like I don't even have a name. I just feel anonymous and doing this work that countless anonymous people have done for the last 2,600 years, which is write down the ancient Greek of Homer. This is how we have it. There's not an original Homer. There's these scribal copies. And in the ancient world, the people who had memorized Homer were called the Homeroi. And I just had this feeling one day, about a year and a half ago, that I was like weirdly making myself one of these Homeroi. I'm like every day memorizing a few lines of Homer, and then I thought, well, what's the truest responsibility to this experience? It's not only to make the translation, but it's to risk learning how to sing Homer myself. And so I started this project that I called the Shadow War. That's a shadow text, and it's essentially just like my retelling of Homer's Iliad as if I myself were one of the anonymous singers of it. And it allows all kinds of error to come in, and different forms of emphases. But it's been really, really happy work. So I'm translating Homer, and I'm making my own version of the Iliad. That's what I'm doing.
Dan, I want to thank you for sharing your brilliance with us today. And I'd also like to extend my gratitude to everyone in the chat for tuning in. As a reminder, I have Dan's book pinned to the top of the chat, and we have a special 40% off coupon. So if you don't have a copy of it yet, make sure to get one. Before we go, Dan, is there anything else that you would like to say?
I just want to thank so many friends for showing up from all over the country and outside of the country too. I'm more um, I'm more thankful than I can say.
And that's all we have for this time. Until next time. Bye, guys.